Hello, class. This is the lecture covering Chapter 1 of our Human Biology textbook, and this chapter is entitled Exploring Life and Science. I begin every lecture with a sometimes brief, sometimes rather long list of questions that you should be able to answer after watching this video and reading Chapter 1. So after reading Chapter 1 and listening to this lecture, you should be able to answer, what is biology? How do we know that something is in fact alive? How do scientists classify those living things? How are all living things organized? And then how will we use the scientific method to determine the things that we know about science? So what are the steps of the scientific method, and how are those steps used to reach those logical conclusions? And you guys will do a lab going through the steps of the scientific method as well. So what is biology? We've probably all heard bio means life, and ology means the study of. So biology is essentially the study of life, specifically the study of living organisms. That field of science can be thought of in many different specialized fields. For example, when I went to college, I studied ecology, so the study of ecosystems. In this class, because we are looking at the human as our study organism, we're going to be looking at things like anatomy, so the parts of the body, physiology, how does it work, origin, where do humans come from, and morphology, which implies the shape of something, tells you about how it is used. So we're going to be looking at several different aspects in the field of biology as we study the human body. So how do we know that something is in fact alive? And a word that might be new to some of you is biotic. And biotic means relating to or resulting from living things. So biotic can simply mean something that is alive. The opposite of that would be abiotic, which implies not living, not alive. And this is a physical thing that is not biological. So if you look at our image here, we can see examples of both biotic, living things, and abiotic. So something that is obviously alive would be the deer, the frog, the cattail, the plant is alive, the fish. Those are all biotic living things, the ladybug, the fern. Some examples of abiotic or non-living but physical things would be the water, the soil that we're going to see underneath the plants. Those are examples of physical things that exist in the environment but are not classified necessarily as alive. So those are abiotic. So how do we know that something is in fact alive and can be included in that study of life of biology? And we're going to go through a list of 6 or 7 things, characteristics that all living things share. So first, life is organized. So in addition to classifying organisms by their relationships to one another, which is something that we will talk about later in this semester, you can also look at their relationships in terms of where they exist within the hierarchy of life. And we're going to be kind of referring back to this image. There's a similar one in your book as well. And if you start from the largest view, this is what we call the biosphere, which contains all of the known living life forms in the universe. And then working back from there, you can narrow down to the ecosystem level. Ecosystems are found within the biosphere. Within the ecosystem, you will find communities, multiple populations, and within the community, you'll find populations, groups of single species. And then populations are made up of individuals. You are an individual human within the population of this class, within the community of the Lincoln Land system. So we're going to spend most of our time this semester at that individual level because we're going to be looking at all of the body systems within the human body. So as we go diving deep down into that individual level, we're going to look at all of the 11 body systems that humans have, all of the organs that make up those body systems, all of the different types of tissue that are needed to perform all of the functions that those body systems do. And then, this is one of my favorite parts, is looking at the cellular level. So how do those cells come together to make up those tissues? And what's going on inside of those cells? When you get down to that cellular level, that's where we stop talking about things being alive. Things that are alive have to be made out of cells. So the things that make up cells, molecules and atoms, are not considered living things. So living things are all contained within this hierarchy. Life is organized. Life also requires materials and energy. All living things obtain their energy from raw materials to keep all of their processes going and staying alive. So this plant is taking in CO2 from its environment and using energy from the sun to convert it into the materials that it needs to stay alive, like sugars. We won't cover photosynthesis this semester as plants are not humans, but this process is essential to our own existence and we wouldn't exist without its byproduct, which is oxygen, something that we will talk about quite a bit. We, living things, humans, take in chemical energy through the food that we eat, and then our bodies break that food down and convert it into energy that we can use. And that energy is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And that molecule, ATP, then fuels all of our body's systems and keeps us alive. So we'll talk about some of those systems too. All living things maintain an internal environment, an internal homeostasis, which is the ability to maintain a stable equilibrium or set of conditions through physiological processes. This is really important because all of those complex molecules like ATP that I was bragging on us for being able to make only work in a very specific set of conditions. So our bodies spend a great deal of energy working to maintain those conditions. Living things respond to their environment. They can take in information from their environment and then respond to those stimuli. So these plants here, these first two pictures, because plants are also living things, remember our examples of thigmotropism. This squash plant is able to climb the trellis because it can feel it and move toward it, respond to its touch. We use our nervous system. We have our senses, sight, feel, and then our brain processes that information and allows us to respond accordingly. So when we cover the nervous system, we'll see that reaction time in a lot more detail. Number 5, living things reproduce and develop. Living things grow and have the ability to reproduce. Some living things, like this amoeba and this strawberry plant, reproduce asexually, meaning that they simply replicate an exact copy of themselves, and there's usually no change in the DNA during that process of asexual reproduction. Humans, on the other hand, our study organism this semester, and this plant, for example, reproduce sexually, which means they produce haploid cells that contain only 50% of their DNA, and then they work really hard to seek out another haploid cell that contains the other half of the DNA needed to grow that organism. So when we cover the stages of human reproduction this semester, we will see how the sperm and the egg each have 50% of the information needed to come together to form an entire human being. But no matter if it's asexual or sexual reproduction, if it's a living thing, it's going to have the ability to reproduce and it's going to develop in a predictable pattern. Infant, toddler, child, adult in the case of humans. Living things all also have an evolutionary history. So we'll talk about evolution in a lot more detail in this semester, but the takeaway here is that if it's a living thing, it's related to all of the other living things in some way. And we'll see where humans fit into that grand scheme. That's one of the last things that we study. But what we will see is that all living things are related to one another. And when we talk about our section on DNA, we'll get to look at all the little nitty-gritty details of how do we know that? What are the similarities and differences between us as humans and organisms that are more closely related to us versus organisms that are more distantly related to us? So how do we classify life forms? We're going to review those relationships when we study evolution, but when we think of it, we often think of that like tree of life that I just showed. And that tree is called a phylogenetic tree. And these are kind of generalized descriptions of the history of life. And they talk about, these are the hypotheses about how those things are related to one another. But when we are organizing or classifying life forms, we have three main domains of life: archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. So archaea and bacteria both contain organisms with what we call prokaryotic cells. And a prokaryote is a cell that lacks a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So we'll look at that in a lot more detail when we look at the cell later on in the semester, next week. And these two types, these two domains, archaea and bacteria, differ greatly from our domain. This is where we are classified under, which is domain eukarya. And eukaryotes are organisms that contain cells with a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So we, humans, are eukaryotes. And the thing that unites all eukaryotes is that we all have cells with membrane-bound nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. And you can see in this image that's going to include all plants, all animals, and all fungi, as well as all of these other related organisms. As you work down into like classifying organisms that are more closely related, then it follows the predictable pattern. Domain, all of the cells are the same. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. So let's look at humans. We just saw that we are in domain eukarya, and we are in kingdom Animalia, so we are animals. Phylum, Chordata, we're chordates, animals with a backbone. Class Mammalia, we are mammals, we have fur and mammary glands. Order Primata, we are primates. Family Hominidae, we are hominids. We'll see other examples of hominids as we discuss organisms that are closely related to humans. We are in genus Homo, the only living member of our genus to this day, and our species epithet is sapiens. So when you're talking about humans, we are talking about Homo sapiens. I'm going to end this video here and make another short video about the scientific method, because that is the focus of our lab for this week. So make sure that you tune in to part 2 of chapter 1.